Hello, and welcome to Hard Conversations. This is a podcast about male sexuality, intimacy, and sex positivity, where we unpack the taboo topic of erectile issues in a safe, non-judgmental space. And now, here's your host, sex therapist, Timothy Norton.
Hello, and welcome to Hard Conversations. My next guest, Robert Nicholson, is a Silicon Valley entrepreneur with many years' experience building online companies and websites. He is the co-founder and president of the ED Treatment Information Center, that's edtreatment.info, a website with a focus on posting authoritative and scientifically validated information on the causes, treatment, and impact of erectile dysfunction. His previous ventures in the online medical information space include drugratings.com and therapistratings.com. Those are both spelled with a Z. He was also an advisor for the website ratemds.com. He has a master's degree in computer engineering from Stanford University and a bachelor's degree in computer science from California State University, Chico. Robert is currently undergoing treatment for ED following a radical prostatectomy. Hello, Robert, and welcome to Hard Conversations. And thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, so I just kind of read through your bio, but why don't you also just tell us a little bit about yourself and what inspired you to start edtreatment.info?
Well, Tim, it's been kind of a long personal journey for me. Like a lot of men, I was first diagnosed with erectile dysfunction when I was in my mid-40s. And for a long time, prescription medications like Viagra or Cialis were effective and allowed me to have a normal sex life. But when I was 60, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer. And I eventually had my prostate removed by an excellent surgeon, Dr. Jonathan Eandy, at the Sutter Medical Center in Sacramento. But after recovering from my surgery, I found that I had severe ED and medications no longer worked. So my doctor, Dr. Eandy, was focused, and I have to say appropriately, on curing my cancer and saving my life. Mm-hmm. And I'm very thankful for that. But after my recovery, to help me deal with the ED, he prescribed Trimix injections, which worked to some extent. And I'll touch on that more later. But he really couldn't provide any more in terms of support. And I felt like I was on my own in dealing with the ED. So I started attending prostate cancer survivors groups. And there was usually a guest speaker, a doctor, who would talk about something like healthy eating or watching for recurrence of cancer. But 90% of the people in the room wanted to talk about ED. And the speakers weren't prepared to deal with that. And that's when I started doing some research on my own, reading books, searching websites. And what I found was confusing and contradictory, often wrong and not very helpful. So I joined some online discussion groups, found a lot of people in the same situation, looking for help and not finding it. And of course, I saw a lot of bad information being passed around. Now, from my bio, you know that my background is in technology. Mm-hmm. I'm a smart guy. I know how to research things, and I know how to build a web business. So I decided that the first thing to do was help myself. And I did that by talking to experts, reading medical journals, reading clinical research, learning everything that I could about erectile dysfunction. And then I wanted to use that information to build a website to help other guys. So that was kind of the goal, and that brings us to today.
Okay. Well, that's really cool. Yeah, your bio doesn't mention, I mean, you have a long history in tech. You started Stanford, you go to Oracle, Hewlett Packard. It wasn't, they kind of just mentioned some of the more recent stuff. But yeah, you've been a successful Silicon Valley guy up there and a long career. And then, so let's go back to your 40s when your first dealing with erectile issues. And so at that time, can you tell us a little bit more about what that experience was like?
Well, back in my 40s, I started having some problems. I was embarrassed to talk to my doctor about it, but I had a pretty good relationship with him, so I did. And he said, very typical for most men, as you age, your circulatory system deteriorates. And all that stuff I've been telling you about diet and exercise, well, you really should have been paying attention. But for now, we're going to give you some medications, and they're going to help. You take them half an hour ahead of time, and you'll be able to have an erection. So I think it was pretty much first-line treatment protocol. Tell the patient what the problem is, give him the pills, and send him home. And I didn't feel particularly good about that. It was kind of a sign of aging, things going wrong in my body.
Yeah.
But it worked for a long time.
Okay. But even looking back now, it sounds like you probably know a lot more about this topic now than you did in your 40s. In your 40s, you probably took the pill, maybe Googled it once or twice, and then that was just that was just what it was, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So looking back, do you feel like that was still probably the best treatment for you?
Yes, I think that the oral medications, the PDE5 inhibitors, are the first line treatment protocol, and for a reason. For most men with mild to moderate ED, they work, and it's a bit of a it kind of takes away spontaneity that you have to take the pill beforehand. But it's a viable solution for most men with mild to moderate ED.
Okay, and it worked for you. And did it work every time? Did you ever have any issues with it not working?
There were issues. There were times when it didn't work, mostly when I hadn't followed the protocols. So, for example, Viagra should not be taken with heavy meals or fatty foods.
Okay.
So if I went out and had a hamburger and fries, and then took a Viagra pill, the results weren't very good.
Oh man.
Also, as I got older, it was less effective, and I had to increase the dosage. And again, that's pretty normal for guys in their 40s and 50s who are using the oral medications.
And when you increased your dosage, did you notice any side effects?
I would occasionally have a headache, not enough to where it caused me to not use the medication.
Right.
For some men, the side effects can be severe. And in that case, the doctor may switch them to a different medication. If you're having serious side effects with Viagra, try Cialis or Levitra. And if they respond poorly to all of the oral medications, well, then you move on to another treatment protocol.
Right. Okay. And certainly your headache was never so bad that you didn't feel like having sex.
Not in my case.
Okay.
But for some men it is. And for those men, obviously, the oral medications aren't the right solution.
Okay. So the PDE5 inhibitors were working throughout your 40s and your 50s. And then what were your first symptoms of prostate cancer?
Actually, I didn't have any symptoms, and that's pretty typical. My doctor, my primary care physician, believes in PSA screenings, and so he had me take a PSA test as part of a routine checkup. And he said, your PSA test numbers came up kind of high. I want to repeat the test. And he did. Numbers came back high again. So he said, okay, we're going to get you in to see an oncologist and see what the symptoms are, what the situation is. At that point, I had a biopsy, and it came back positive for cancer. Oh. So were it not for the routine screening, my prostate cancer probably would not have been detected.
And how old were you when you started getting the routine screenings?
I believe my doctor started that when I turned 50.
Okay.
I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, I think that's pretty typical is 50. Okay. And then biopsy and pretty bad news. How did you take that?
It was terrifying for me. Prostate cancer has a very high survival rate.
Right.
But the word cancer
Yeah.
is still frightening. I think it goes back to when we're little kids and we hear those adult conversations. I just heard that Aunt Mary has cancer.
Right.
Oh my God. How long does she have? And we remember that. So just hearing the word cancer, it really scared me. I also personally have a terrible fear of hospitals and surgery. It's almost a phobia. So for me, it was very hard to make the decision to have surgery. And it was very hard to actually go through with it. The night before, I contemplated getting in my car and running away. My girlfriend was just incredibly supportive. She was there every step of the way. She let me talk about my feelings and my fears and encouraged me to think about the future and getting past this. I probably would not have gone through the surgery if it weren't for her. I have to say that waking up from the surgery, finding her waiting for me was one of the most amazing feelings in my life, just being alive. And when my doctor came in and told me that the surgery had gone very well and he had cleanly removed all the cancer, I had this tremendous feeling of relief. Even the recovery went very well. I'd had a laparoscopic robotic surgery, so the incisions were very small. I was up and around the next day. Wow. And I just had to take it easy for a couple of months while everything healed. But at about the 2-month mark, when I found that I was completely unable to have an erection, I took that very badly. For a long time, I was very depressed. And I mean, how weird is that? I was cured of cancer, but I felt worse than ever.
Yeah.
And that's when I started reaching out, looking for answers.
Because in that surgery, they literally remove your prostate.
Absolutely. But my doctor is the head of robotic surgery at Sutter Medical Center. So the incisions are incredibly small, and it's all done with robotic instruments. And they do a clean excision around the boundaries of the prostate. And they're able to withdraw it from a very small incision. I'm astounded by the technology involved in surgeries these days.
Yeah, definitely. And now, a couple months later, no erections, and they probably had warned you about that.
Yeah, they had warned me about it. They did. In fairness, my doctor did tell me that that's a frequent occurrence, but when you're dealing with cancer, everything else kind of just fades into the background noise. It's like, am I going to survive this?
Right.
And the warning there was very clear. Prostate cancer has a very high survival rate, but if it metastasizes and spreads through your body, then the odds shift dramatically.
Right.
So in the opinion of my surgeon, the idea is get it out so that you never have to deal with that.
Right. And what's the timeline for all this? So first of all, you had a girlfriend. How long had you guys been together at the point where you were diagnosed?
We'd been together for about 3 years.
3 years.
So we were living together. We had a good relationship, and she is a person that she was just very supportive and really helped me through it.
Okay, and not to get too personal, but sometimes in really long-term relationships, like if you've been together since your 20s, like sex starts to, for some couples, fade to the background and be less significant. But 3 years into a relationship, it was probably a really important part of your relationship.
Yeah. Yes.
And the prospect of not getting erections anymore was probably really daunting.
Absolutely. And, fortunately, I think we're both, pretty open people sexually. And so we explored a lot of other ways for, having an intimate, satisfying sexual relationship. It's not all about the ability to have an erection. So,
Right. Now, what did they tell you with regard to how long it would be like that for? Did they say that it would come back, or did they just kind of say you might not ever get erections again?
One of the problems is that there's not a lot of good data out there, surprisingly. So what my doctor said, based on his experience, and he's done hundreds of prostatectomies, he said that recovery time for the ability to have an erection is generally 1 to 2 years if you recover. And he said, in my case, because I had ED beforehand and it was progressing, the odds that I would ever recover were pretty small. So he was pretty clear after the surgery that I could not expect the ability to have a normal erection again.
And that's got to be really horrible news.
Yeah.
Was that at your appointment where you went in after a couple months? Was that when he kind of said it to you, or was it like right after the surgery?
I went in and asked him about it. Where do things stand? What are the next steps? What's the prognosis? Again, my girlfriend was with me. She was very supportive, sat in on the meetings, because oftentimes I would be in a mental state where things just kind of went past me, and then she'd tell me afterwards what he said. But he said that he didn't think the prognosis was good. The oral medications just didn't work for me at all at that point. So he prescribed penile injections with a drug called Trimix, which is actually a mixture of 3 drugs. That's why it's called Trimix. I'm not sure how many of your listeners are familiar with this, but you have a tiny little needle and you inject the drug directly in your penis about half an hour or an hour ahead of time, just as if you were taking a pill. And then it lasts for a couple of hours. This helps a lot of men who no longer respond to the oral medications. So it's kind of a second-line treatment. But in my case, it doesn't always work. It's pretty hit or miss. My ED is at the point where even the injections are kind of borderline as to whether they're going to be effective or not. And so on my website, we talk about some of the newer treatments like shockwave therapy and PRP injections. But frankly, the research results are mixed at this point.
Yeah.
And because these treatments have not gone through the FDA approval process, there's no established peer-reviewed treatment protocol. So if you go that route, you have to really look into the doctor's track record, because the way he is doing shockwave treatment may be entirely different from the way another doctor is doing the same treatment. The companies that are doing a lot of this work could run peer-reviewed clinical studies. And it somewhat concerns me that they're not doing that.
Yeah, that's good.
So what we have is a lot of self-reporting. Oh, we've helped 80% of our patients.
Yeah.
But you have to take it with a grain of salt. And the other thing that concerns me about it not being an FDA-approved clinical trial is when you do a clinical trial, you're establishing the treatment protocol. Here's how you do it. If it's medication, here's the optimum dosage, and here's how often you administer the treatment and so forth. Without those clinical trials, you're not establishing that base methodology. Mm-hmm. And what that means is that 2 doctors may be administering the treatment in an entirely different way, and you just don't know what results you're going to get.
Right.
So I have a lot of concerns. I think there's a lot of potential there, but I think to some extent the people who are promoting this have a very self-defeating attitude by not opening up their results.
Right. And that's always going to give you pause. Definitely.
Not to mention, these treatments can be very expensive. And because they're not FDA approved, they're not covered by insurance. So it's a significant out-of-pocket expense for something where you don't know what the results are going to be.
Right.
So personally, I've started looking into a surgical implant, which we also talk about on our site. And I think ultimately that's going to be the right treatment for me, given the stage of my ED.
Okay. And for the listeners who haven't yet listened to my interview with the urologist, with Dr. Gonzalez, we do talk about injections and penile implants, and we also talk about it on episode with Max on like the second or third one. But so you've done those injections?
I have done the injections. Okay. Yes. For me, it's hit or miss. Okay. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I will say that the injections as a second line treatment help a lot of men who are no longer responding to the oral medication. So it's not hopeless at that point. I would say that my case is pretty extreme. And so at this point, even the injections don't always work for me.
Okay. Is it painful to do the injection?
No, it was scary. Nobody wants to stick a needle in their penis.
Right.
But the needle is very fine. It's just, a hairline type needle. You go into the doctor's office for the first time and he shows you how to do the injection, has you do it yourself in the office. And once you've done it a few times, it's like a pinprick. It's very easy, becomes pretty much automatic. And so I would not let that be off-putting at all. It's just not a big deal.
Okay. And then how long does it last for?
Typically a couple of hours. What you need to do with this is you need to find the right dosage. And what the doctor will typically do is have you start at a very low dose where you may hardly notice the effect. It certainly doesn't give you a serviceable erection. And then he'll say, I want you to increase this by 2 units each time until you get a serviceable erection. And at that point, stop. You don't want to overdose with this. Some guys are saying, hey, boy, 15 milligrams are kind of working. I'm going to go for 25. And you don't want to do that because there's a serious risk of priapism, which is the condition where you have a painful, long-lasting erection and you need to go into a doctor and get it treated and get the blood drained out of your penis, which is not at all pleasant. You don't want to go through that. So for guys that try this, follow the doctor's directions, increase the dosage in small amounts until it works for you, and then stop at that point.
And you haven't gone through priapism?
Actually, I, on one occasion, for whatever reason, just had an erection that just didn't go down. And at about the 3.5 hour mark, I started to say, well, something's wrong here. And the general recommendation is if you experience this, the first thing to do is to take some over-the-counter decongestants. Take a couple of Sudafed, apply some ice, and if it doesn't go down in half an hour to an hour, then get yourself into an urgent care center. In my case, the Sudafed and the ice worked, but I was definitely on that borderline.
Okay. Wow, that must have been an interesting afternoon.
Yeah.
And your girlfriend's there with you the whole time. Yeah.
Yes. And of course she was saying, we should go to a doctor. And of course, being a guy, it's like, no.
What are they going to do? Right.
Take care of this. And fortunately, the kind of prescribed first line response worked.
Right.
And
in those cases, do you stay hard after you ejaculate with that injection? Okay.
Yes. So the mechanism that releases blood from the penis just doesn't work. The drugs are overriding it, and it's just not letting the blood flow out. And so what that does is you now have this blood trapped in your penis. It's not flowing out, but you're also not getting a fresh blood supply flowing in. So the tissues aren't being oxygenated, and you can do serious and permanent damage by not getting the blood flow and the oxygenation through your penis. And that's why it's a serious issue. That's why you need to get that blood to flow out, fresh blood to flow in. And if it doesn't happen, you need to see a doctor right away. Right.
Okay. And now you're considering implant. And every time I've talked to someone in the urological world about penile implants, they give me just very glowing responses and very high customer satisfaction. So where are you in the process of making that decision, and what are you hearing?
In terms of patient satisfaction, I hear the same thing. One of the things that we found in some of the survey work that we've done, which I can touch on later, is that satisfaction with treatments for ED is very low across the board. Guys are just not satisfied with the treatment until you come to penile implants, where the patient satisfaction rate is like 90%.
Yeah.
I mean, you have guys in their 60s saying, man, I wish I'd done this when I was 20.
Yeah, it sounds great. You just pump it up.
Yeah. So you can have an erection whenever you want, for as long as you want. Pretty magical. Certainly there's a surgical procedure, and that can be frightening. And there is a recovery period, which for some men lasts weeks and can be very painful. But once you get past that, it pretty much just works. Unlike a lot of the other treatments that we've talked about, where in my experience and the experience of other men, kind of hit or miss. It doesn't work every time. It may not work at all. So.
Okay. And are you on the verge of pulling the trigger, or are you still just kind of taking your time with it?
I am in the process of considering a move. And so what I want to do is figure out where I'm going to be living and then investigate, local surgeons and local surgical centers. So I haven't stepped up to the point of actually making the commitment yet, but it's definitely something that I'm planning on doing as soon as I'm at a point in my life where that makes sense.
Okay. You're really situated, well, at least with your website and all this research that you've done into this condition. You know a lot about it. I was going through your website after I reached out to you, and I was just like, this is perfect. This is really succinct, and it's really well laid out. And I guess, is that just, I mean, there's treatments, there's the herbal, the medical, the surgeries, the foods. You've got a section on finding doctors and coaches. You go through all of the causes. And you even have a section on book reviews in there. Everything. So what inspired you to be so thorough about this?
Well, when I started doing my own research, I just really wasn't happy with the quality of the information that I was finding. So I wanted to do a better job. So with my team of advisors, we decided a couple things. We wanted everything that we posted on the site to be backed up by strong research. We wanted to share the links to the research to be credible and to let people do further reading on their own. We wanted the content to be driven by what users wanted to know. So when we get a question or we see something come up in a discussion forum and we don't have an answer, then we go off and research that and add a page to the site. So it's very much user-driven, well-researched, and authoritative. Those were kind of our ground rules. I also have to say that I've gotten tremendous help from Dr. Aaron Spitz. He's on our advisory board. He's one of the foremost urologists in the United States. He's been incredibly generous with his time and advice and knowledge. And I have to say, I don't know if you've read his recent book, The Penis Book, which came out last year.
When I saw it on your site, I just bought it. I was like, that looks great.
Well, Aaron is a really funny guy. He worked his way through college doing stand-up comedy. I have read dozens of books on ED and sexual health, as you probably have yourself. And I can honestly say this is the only book where I was laughing out loud as I read it.
Okay, that's good. Because
he's got a great way of taking serious material and making it lighthearted. And I think when people are concerned about ED and feeling bad about themselves, that approach really helps.
Yeah, definitely. That I'll look through that thoroughly, because sometimes, especially if you're dealing with some of the traumatic effects of this, a little lightheartedness is probably, very welcome.
Yes.
Because and like you say, well, so you guys even ventured out into having intimate contact without erections, right? So you guys were already on that wavelength as well, and that's really good to hear. Where did you come up with that? Was that just from discussions, or did you also read about that a little bit?
Well, this really came out of the survey research that we did. And one of the takeaway points that we came away with is that for a lot of couples, it isn't so much about not having an erection and not having penetration. Obviously, that's a factor. But what really happens is the ED causes men to withdraw, causes couples to separate to where they're not having any intimacy in their relationship anymore. And that's what they really miss. So one of the things that I think people need to think about is you can have a satisfying sexual relationship that doesn't involve an erection every time. You can still have that intimacy, which is what's really lacking in a lot of relationships when the men are dealing with ED.
Definitely. I really like the way that you say that. And it's also nice that this was an evidence-informed decision on your part. So why don't we talk about this study that, did you fund it personally? Did you get investors? Did you just, how did you do it?
No, we funded this. We do have the advisors have put a little bit of money into the site at this point. We're starting to make some revenue from advertising on the site. But it wasn't terribly expensive to do this.
Okay.
The biggest expense was in promoting it to get people to the site to take the survey.
Okay. And you ended up like getting over almost 700 people to fill it out, and then not everybody scored high enough on the assessment tool to determine whether or not you have an erectile dysfunction. And then, but by the people who did, you had almost 600 guys.
Yes, we ended up with about 597 or 98 valid responses from qualified individuals.
And 70 questions, right? 70 some odd questions that they were answering.
Yeah, well, not quite. There were 70 questions in the survey, but a lot of them were qualified questions. So, have you tried penile injections? If no, we're going to skip the 3 questions about penile injections.
Okay.
So the average person ended up taking about 45 questions, still a long survey.
Yeah.
So We kind of went overboard there, and we learned from that. And in the future, we're going to be doing smaller surveys. But we did get some really great information. We learned a lot from this. Unfortunately, what we learned is pretty discouraging. By overwhelming numbers, what the guys said is they're not satisfied with the support they've gotten. They're not satisfied with their doctors. They're not satisfied with their treatment result. So just for example, we asked about doctors. 38% of the guys said they were very dissatisfied with their doctor. 32% said they were somewhat dissatisfied. Only 24% said they were somewhat satisfied, and only 6% said they were very satisfied. Mm-hmm. So if we were to graph this, the graph would be way over on the dissatisfied end of things. As far as treatment options, we asked about a bunch of different treatments, and if you've tried this, how satisfied were you? For every single treatment option, there were more dissatisfied men than satisfied. Every one. And at this point, I do want to remind your listeners that the one thing that we didn't ask about or didn't get enough responses about were penile implants. And we didn't get enough responses to include penile implants in our results, just because it's a relatively small number of men. But again, other research shows that's a treatment where the men are overwhelmingly satisfied.
Right.
I want to put that in a separate category almost. But I think what the research showed us is that the first-line treatment protocols and second-line treatment protocols really aren't doing the job. ED treatments haven't really changed in 20 years. And doctors are not providing the advice and help and support that men are looking for. And those are two of the big takeaways from our survey.
The advice, the help and support. So did you get a sense of what was so dissatisfying about their experience with their doctors?
Part of it is the men themselves have a hard time communicating.
Right.
There's still a lot of stigma around ED. And one of the things that they told us is that they're embarrassed talking about it. 40% of the men who responded to our survey said they're not comfortable talking to their doctor. And almost half, 48%, said they're not comfortable talking to their spouse or partner. So this leads to the men being isolated and feeling like they get no support, partly because of their own lack of communication. But the other thing that we found is that doctors prescribe the medication. They do some tests. They say, here's a prescription, go get these pills, bye. And that's sort of the end of it. And what is lacking is support for the emotional needs of the men who are getting treatment for ED. So we found that the great majority of men have experienced loss of confidence, lack of self-esteem, and a negative impact on their relationship. And more than 80% of the respondents had experienced each of those things. So what we're saying here is that there's a big emotional impact that nobody is helping them to deal with. We had an open comment section on the survey where men could just talk about their feelings. And if I can, I'd like to share some of the quotes just to really show what these guys are going through.
Yeah, I'd love that. And they consented to having quotes shared and everything, I hope, in there.
They consented to having the information shared,
okay.
And besides which it's anonymous.
Right, okay, great.
This is in no way associated with an individual.
Great.
So a few of the quotes. I feel inadequate and demoralized. I can't share my feelings of physical love for her. My desire is always there, but I can't realize it. It has cost me self-respect. It has caused me to lose feelings of closeness and desire. My feeling of being inadequate has severely damaged my relationship. I've been belittled and shamed. I just have to accept it. I don't feel like a good husband because I can't have a relationship with my wife. It's been years with no sexual contact. Bring on death. I have no life quality, and my only joy is my children. So this is really painful stuff, and nobody's talking about it, and nobody is helping guys get past that, partly because they don't know how to ask for help.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. We don't do the best job of training men how to talk about difficult things like this. And then even if they were kind of good at it with something as stigmatized as sex, it's going to be difficult for doctors to.
Yeah. And even the doctors aren't prepared to deal with it.
Right. We've talked about it on this show before with a couple of different guests. There's all these statistics in the sex education community about the very small amount of training that doctors typically get in sexual health. And
yeah, I'm actually glad you mentioned that, because I've also had this conversation with my own primary care physician back when I was going through the early stages of ED. And what he told me at the time is that, as he recalled, he probably got 6 to 8 hours of instruction dealing with erectile dysfunction in his whole medical education. He understood the physical causes and the psychological causes, but he'd never been trained on the emotional issue that comes from ED. And so it's not surprising that his approach is deal with the medical issue that he's been trained to deal with and provide no emotional support, because nobody's taught him how to do that. And think about how different it would be if the doctor said to you, I'm going to prescribe some medications that should help with your problem. But a lot of men who have ED start feeling bad about themselves, maybe withdraw from their partners, and even have depression. So I want you to know that these things are very normal. And if you feel that way, it can be really good to talk to your partner about it, maybe get some counseling. I'm going to give you some referral information here with some people you can talk to. And if you have any questions about this, please give the office a call, because we know how tough it can be to deal with. I mean, how much difference would it make if the doctor spent literally 1 or 2 minutes having that brief conversation, but they're not trained to do that?
No. Yeah, definitely not. And from my perspective, even as a sex therapist, I regularly will get clients because they've reached a point in therapy with their regular therapist who isn't comfortable talking about sex. And this is a person who's probably comfortable talking about really painful emotions, about death and suicide and childhood trauma and all kinds of things. But then when it gets to the sex, there's, even for us, okay, we're supposed to be the people who are able to talk about anything, there's still this gap. So to imagine, a doctor or anybody, there's just no way that they're going to be adequately competent in talking about this without training, without, as a part of becoming a sex therapist, I had to look at my own sexuality. You have to look at, any taboos that you still have, and you have to be able to really frankly just say, okay, so how was your penis this week? And talking about butts and talking about like every possible thing and ejaculating and all that stuff. And it's not necessarily hard, but you have to put in the work. And you have to really get comfortable doing it. So yeah, I can imagine that a lot of that work just isn't getting done. Now, have you come across the folks down in San Diego, Dr. Goldstein, and some of his research and what they're doing down there? It's pretty interesting.
No, I have not.
Yeah, they the place. I'll send you a link to it. It's called something like the Sexual Health Center, but. To address that component of, okay, when are we going to talk about the emotions? They have a team. You see him, you see a pelvic floor person, and you see a therapist as a standard part of the treatment. It's not just you're probably going to have emotional things. You are, and we want you to at least, I don't know what they mandate, but it's a treatment team. And I think a nurse practitioner in there as well. So that should probably be the standard for not just for this, but for a lot of things where there's going to be trauma and anxiety about any medical condition.
Yes, absolutely. Recognize the emotional impact and the part that plays in the healing process as well.
Yeah, definitely. So you run this study, and God, reading through some of that stuff is it's pretty heartbreaking.
Yeah, it is. And we're hoping that we can help make a difference. At a minimum, we want guys to understand that they're not going through this alone, that other people have similar experiences, and that there are people they can talk to. We also did a second survey where we targeted specifically partners of men with ED, to see what we learned from their perspective. We found that the partners also go through a loss of self-esteem and confidence in about the same numbers as men. They often feel undesirable or like they've done something wrong, and they feel responsible for the man's ED. And guys need to realize that. They need to realize what their partners are going through. And the survey that we did really made me rethink my relationship with my girlfriend. She's been tremendously supportive, and I took that for granted. And I never thought, or I hadn't thought about how my ED was affecting her emotionally. And since that time, I've had some very good talks with her. It's opened up some really wonderful conversations, but I needed to take that step. So, this is one of the things that we are hearing from the women is they feel a lot of pain. Women and men, partners of men with ED, they're feeling a lot of pain, and the guy isn't willing to talk about it. Again, it's not so much about the sex, it's the lack of communication and the lack of intimacy and the withdrawal. And I'd like to kind of do what I did for men and share some of the comments that we got from partners.
That'd be great, yeah.
He's too focused on his embarrassment and anger at the situation to hear how rejected I feel. I feel guilty if I have a climax because he can rarely sustain the activity to that point. It's exhausting to try to keep things going when he really isn't able, but he wants to keep trying. And then I feel guilty about not wanting to keep working at it when it just doesn't work. I love him dearly, but it's hard not to have intimacy. He avoids contact because he thinks it might lead to something and he will fail. I miss the physical closeness we once shared. I feel bad for him that he can no longer satisfy his needs, and I understand his frustration, but I miss physical closeness, even simply cuddling. My needs aren't being addressed, and I feel ignored and just very sad. It's been difficult because he doesn't want to talk about it. I feel very lonely and disconnected from my husband. I think he must feel the same way, but he avoids talking about it. He acts immature and defensive when he loses his erection during sex. He withdraws in many ways. He shuts down when I try and discuss it, and he won't try other forms of intimacy. It's taken a major toll on my feelings of self-esteem and self-worth. So what we see here in comment after comment, as well as the formal questions on the survey, is that the problems aren't directly caused by not having an erection. It's the lack of communication, the withdrawal from intimacy, and the failure to get help. Yeah, one more thing, we do see a difference between men and their partners. Partners in general are significantly more open to talking about the problem and significantly more open to getting help or counseling than the men are themselves. And so that can often cause conflict in their relationships because the men feel pressured and they don't want to deal with it. So what guys really need to hear and understand is that their partners are hurting just as much as they are, and not getting help is damaging their relationships.
Yes, definitely. And I think One of the things that I learned early on that a lot of sex therapists feel and a lot of sex educators is that regardless of the nature of the problem, if it's an erectile issue or pelvic pain or something like that, that sexual problems are couples problems.
Yes.
And a lot of the times guys are getting the message, either from their own filter because they hear things cynically or because it's very literally the message, but they hear the message from their partner, go in and fix your dick. And it's not, that's not really the best way to approach it. Like, not all partners have to come in, but they should at least be open to the idea and at least be willing to come in for a couple of sessions, because, in the case where you're not even cuddling anymore and you're not talking about it, those are things that, if I'm working with a guy alone, like he's got to go home and talk about those things, and I prefer to be able to talk to both of them and say, okay, you guys got to cuddle. We got to talk about these things. We got to get somewhere with this. and that's a big piece. Yeah. Where your sex isn't just happening in a vacuum. You've got a partner who probably doesn't even care as much about the erection as just the loss of intimacy.
Yes. So Tim, you get this. You understand how sexual issues affect couples. In the erectile dysfunction community, people aren't having these conversations. Mm-hmm. It's all about what are the causes and how do I treat it? And maybe there's a psychological cause. So, gosh, I guess I need to talk to a counselor or a therapist. But nobody is really talking about dealing with the impact on relationships. And that's part of what we're trying to do with our site, is get people to start having those conversations.
And that was what inspired me to start the podcast. Yeah, no, I get it. Because a lot of the time, it's one thing to have your prostate removed and that's a really severe form of erectile dysfunction that you are suffering from. But a lot of the time, guys can really bounce back from this, especially in their 20s and their 30s, with a fairly minimal amount of treatment. And having good conversations in any relationship is a really good idea. About sex and intimacy and unmet needs and those kinds of things. A lot of times people have no idea of what their spouse or their partner is looking for or needs. And a lot of times they're really easy needs to fulfill. You just, I didn't know you wanted that. Wish you would have told me 15 years ago, because I would have gladly done it. So I'm glad you guys are doing this research, and you're, how's the traffic to the site? Where you guys were promoting it and everything?
We're doing a lot of what is called search engine optimization, which means putting the right keywords on the site, and then getting other sites to link to us and participating in forums and things where we get link backs. It's a lot of work, and it's not an overnight project. We've been working on the site for over a year now, and just since probably the last month, probably since mid-December, we've seen a pretty sharp uptick in the traffic. So we're feeling really good about where we are right now. The work that we've been doing is really starting to pay off. And we're also getting a lot of questions and comments and outreach, people contacting us about the site. So that's all good. That's what we wanted to see, and we're starting to get there.
That's really cool. And one thing that I remember reading on your site is you have a little section on how to start a support group. Has anybody actually taken you up on that?
No.
Okay.
In honesty, this is one of our early ideas that hasn't worked out. What we find is people are too busy. They feel they lack the knowledge or the resources or the time, and it just doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. What we have heard from people is that there is interest in some online support groups. Mm-hmm. So we're working on figuring out how we could do that, but that's probably going to be a direction that we take the site in the future, is adding some online resources for support, because the idea of having people go out and start local support groups in their community. Just hasn't happened.
Right. Well, obviously the stigma, we always run into that, but I've known therapists who working with people with major physical disabilities and couldn't get out of the house, or maybe like major social phobias, who have started, I think, in like Google Hangouts kinds of support groups, and
Yes.
I think one guy I talked to actually had a group up to 8 at one point that he was having a lot of success with. So it's not unprecedented.
Right. And Zoom and Skype, offer facilities for group conferencing. So, there are some tools out there. It's a matter of putting in place the organization, getting the people to participate, doing the scheduling and so forth. But definitely one of the things that we hope to do in the near future.
Cool. And you've done this research. It sounds like you've done a lot of research. Have you noticed some other gaps in the research, or are you looking at any future directions?
Well, I would say there's been this long period, essentially 20 years, where treatment protocols haven't changed and there haven't been any real advances. Hopefully some of the things that are starting to happen over the last couple of years will pan out with new established treatments. That's something that we can't do very much about, but I think it really points out the need for more investment in medical research. Obviously, there's the need, which we've discussed at length, for better emotional support. So one of the things that we're doing on the site, as I mentioned, is providing more resources, more help on a emotional support side. We are also trying to address that question that we talked about earlier about doctors not being trained to treat these conditions. We're working on putting together some resources and content specifically targeted to doctors, saying, here's what you need to understand about the psychological and emotional impact of ED on relationships, and here are some basic and simple things that you can do to help address this. So that's something that we will probably be rolling out in about a month, where we're working on some content specifically to target the medical community.
Interesting. And would you be doing that in like a webinar or like educational video format?
Material on the site, both text material and video. Probably setting up some webinars, and even going to the point of putting together a small pamphlet that we can send out to doctors saying, here's what you need to understand about the emotional impact of ED. Here's some of the research we've done. Here are some facts that you can incorporate into your practice and the advice that you're giving your patients.
Yeah. And it would even be nice to maybe at some point present at a medical conference or at some trainings or something along those lines.
Yes, that's a really good idea. We're taking a multi-prong approach. One of the things I know about building a web business is you try a lot of different things and you measure the results and you see what works. So we will often roll out information in several different formats. We'll do a written page on our site. We'll have a YouTube video. We'll share through social media. We'll post in forums, and then we see what kind of response we get. And then we find out what's working and we do more of that.
Well, great stuff, Robert. Really, really glad to know that someone with your background is out there and a part of this cause and doing really good work. And I'm glad that, I guess I was probably a part of that uptick in the traffic to your website. However, I came across your information. And that's really good, and I'm just really glad to have met you and to have had this interview.
Well, Tim, I thank you for the opportunity to appear on your podcast. I really appreciate the work that you're doing. I've been listening to your podcasts, and I think that's exactly the kind of conversation that people need to be having, just being more open about sex and intimacy in general. So
All right.
Thank you for the work that you're doing.
You're welcome, and thank you. And thank everybody for listening. And where can everybody find you on the internet? And are you on Twitter, or is it just the website?
We have the website, edtreatment.info. Mm-hmm. And at the bottom of the page, we have links to a Facebook page, a Twitter page, and a LinkedIn page. Okay. So, and our YouTube page. So, again, we've got multiple communication channels, and we welcome questions and feedback and requests for help. Whatever we can do. We like hearing from people and like hearing about what they're looking for and what has helped them.
All right. Sounds great. Okay, everybody check out edtreatment.info. And thank you so much, Robert.
Okay. Thank you, Tim.
Thanks to the show's executive producer, Robin Morrison. Thanks to Kat Murphy, director of social media. Thanks to Team Scrub for the music. Thanks to the sound engineer, Ravi Carmen. Thanks to Brian Hui for naming the show. Thanks to Alex Pitts for the intro. Thanks to Arlene Asuncion for the logo. You can find this podcast at hardconversationspodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts. You can locate me on Twitter at TimNortonLCSW or on my website for my private practice, timnortontherapy.com. You can also email us at hardconversationspodcast@gmail.com or call into our hotline at 662-626-4276. That's 662-MAN-HARD. Thanks to all my friends and family for brainstorming this show with me. Shoutouts to the sex-positive community, including sex educators, sex therapists, sex coaches, other fellow sex podcasters, sex surrogates, academics, the sexual health medical community, sex workers, the tantric community, and everybody else involved with having hard conversations. Bye-bye.